Welcome everybody to the next episode of Challenge Accepted, the podcast where we are interrogating why 96.5% of all of the content we create gets zero traffic. I'm delighted to welcome today's special guest, Emma Dyer, Chief Revenue and Brand Officer at the Royal Kennel Club. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
She's been at the heart of making sure a heritage brand refresh has kept all of the relevancy without losing trust and familiarity. And today's episode is all about consistency. Ginny, as always, joins us from a behavioural scientist point of view, and I'm sure consistency and our brains come hand in hand. Hello again, Ginny.
Hello.
Yes, we're talking about consistency. Doesn't always sound the most exciting thing to talk about, I guess. But without repetition, without reinforcement, I think even the boldest ideas can fall flat. And to give us a bit more context, those of you that follow marketing communications, Cannes Lions, which is a massive film festival, is also a film festival, but keep on topic, Lucy. Stay consistent with the message. The marketing show that they've had recently, their strongest element was about consistency. The fact that strong creative core over time sees much more resilient results. The System 1 research company showed that brands that keep consistent messaging deliver 28% more business effect and grow market share twice as effectively as less consistent ones are. You'll have to read the report to find out what those business effects are. I'm not going to rattle them all off now, but for something as big as Cannes Lions to have the biggest focus of everything they did was about consistency, I think that's reason enough for us to talk about it in its own podcast. So, Emma, let's talk about consistency and your marketing experience. Where have you seen examples of consistency building longer term equity? You've had a fairly extensive marketing career across some pretty big names. So where do you see consistency building that long term equity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important topic and something that I think is overlooked for shinier, more exciting things. But ultimately, I think the thing to remember with consistency for me is it can be exciting. Yeah. And I think throughout various different organizations, I've come to a point in the way I describe consistency as being important is it's a person, right? If a person is consistent with you, and the brand is the person, you're more likely to engage, you know what to expect, you feel reassured. And that in and of itself can create some really compelling, engaging content. So consistency doesn't actually have to be boring. It has to be evolving potentially. And I think brands, sometimes if you stay consistent too long, it can become a bit dry. So I think it's a fine balancing act. One of the places I worked where I saw two brands come to mind. I think the first is Gauloises, which is a taboo tobacco product, albeit, but that was a fantastic brand. Not so much the product, obviously, but the brand itself was absolutely fantastic. It'd been around for hundreds of years. It went all the way back to the Gallic helmets in France, and actually they had just let the brand sit for too long. And with that refresh, we were able to really bring the brand back to life. And that refresh that we did 13 years ago now, is still in place, right? But it's evolved and it's grown in its execution, but the North Star has remained the same. And we've seen the equity in that brand really rise, or at least when I left 5 years after completing it, it had increased all equity scores across the board, which was great. And it was a similar situation, should I say, with Birdseye. They had, again, in a very natural thing for organizations to do, you don't think of brand. You kind of think of brand and consistency and bringing it back to life after it's kind of too late. And so they had left that brand sit there. Again, coming back to that North Star, defining that and staying true to that is what's seen Birdseye come through. And the platform we developed there, the creative assets that were developed, the captain, that iconic asset from God knows how long, was actually brought back. So you're going back to where you've been to modernize for today. And that is consistency. But the excitement about bringing back the captain was unparalleled. Like, people got so viscerally excited. And that's an icon that's been around for God knows how long. And, bringing that back is staying true to who you are and being very consistent in that stance, actually does brands a lot of favors. And I actually think is quite exciting. So I think consistency can be as interesting or as dry as you make it.
I remember that. I remember when you brought the captain back, and I remember being like, oh, he's back. Yeah.
Ginny, what goes on in our brains when we see familiar things? Why do we like familiarity?
There are so many reasons why familiarity is a good thing. I will start with one, which is about System 1. And I don't mean System 1, the agency that did the research at Lions. I think they chose that name for a reason.
Good brand name, though. Well done.
Yeah. So it's the theory that our brain has two different ways of thinking. The one that's more unconscious and, takes the shortcuts and just happens in the backgrounds where our habits and our biases are. And then you've got your System 2, which is the thinking brain. And familiarity tends to sit in the System 1. So it's your brain doesn't need to think so hard to know what's going to happen. And so that's why your brain loves shortcuts, and familiarity gives it a shortcut.
Understand. I think there's comfort in it, isn't there? I think there's comfort when you see something or you hear something and you think, oh, I know that. There's a little bit of self-satisfaction, I suppose, of I knew that was that, of tying two things together.
And I think taking that work out for the consumer, that friction, and making it really easy for people to understand, they don't have to decode what brand is it, who's talking to me, what do they stand for. Actually, you're just going straight to let me engage with this topic. So actually, to that System 1 point, it's easier for a brand to land a product, a service, a key message when that familiarity is there, because there's so much easier for the human mind to take in.
Exactly. It's the psychological tax that it doesn't need to pay. So it doesn't need to consider, is this risky? It doesn't need to do anything. Expectations are already there. And it means that it can therefore look at what it's trying to say versus run through that gauntlet of things it needs to consider before it pays attention to something.
Yeah. Yeah. Where have we seen consistency in action? We've touched on it a little bit there with Bird's Eye and Gulwa, your previous experience, but I'm looking through some heritage brands. I think, again, thinking of Royal Kennel Club and Crufts, when you think about Marmite, fairly UK centric, people from the rest of the world, the love it or hate it lines, the should have gone to Specsavers. Where else have you seen where a consistent message has helped a brand? What have we seen that you can immediately think of that worked?
Mm-hmm. In terms of messaging, or in terms of creative?
Messaging, creative brand, where that find an idea.
I'm going to give another example from experience, if you don't mind, and then I might touch on the RKC logo design ever so briefly as a way of how heritage can be leveraged. But I think Samsung, one of my lovely roles there, was checking to within a millimeter of a key visual that the logo was in the right place. And actually, it had to be in the top left all the time. It had to be black background. End frame was so long, had to be centralized. And we knew, again, within a millimeter or so where it had to be centralized. And actually, that really, when we were executing that consistently visually, there was such an uplift in recognitions that people wouldn't actually need the logo necessarily to be on things. They would start to recognize an ad as a Samsung ad. And I think they do that really well, and they've stayed the course with that. I also think Apple do it quite well. But then you start to look at other brands. And I think the area that gets really interesting for me on this topic is mnemonics, because actually mnemonics play a huge role when consistently executed in helping people decode and deliver that brand attribution back to businesses, whereby if you consistently execute the Netflix or the Audi do it really well without
Yep.
mnemonic, actually, I think that's a really rich territory that's often forgotten about or overlooked, because if you have a sound, you don't have to be watching it. You can be in the kitchen while the TV is on and, you know, it's gone in, you're receiving that message. And I think there are some iconic brands that do it really, really well. In terms of heritage informing kind of consistent execution, I think we can take the RKC logo, whereby there has always been two dogs on that logo. There has always been a centralized element to that logo. Visually, it has ebbed and flowed a little bit, but for the most part, it has been very consistent across the decades. And actually what it does is it stays very true to why the organization was founded in the first instance. And you can see that even more today, 153 years later, in the current logo, that actually it's more true to 153 years ago than where we have been. And actually being consistent in its execution reminds people what the RKC stands for, why we exist, and why we play such a leading role in pedigree dog ownership in Britain today, and not shying away from that.
Yeah, and I think your brief to us of evolving or re-looking at that logo, we were very mindful of retaining that story. There's a story behind that logo. Every element in it has got a reason that it's there. It's not just, you know, being brought together because a creative somewhere thought that would look nice on it. There's a story behind each and every element. And I think we were very mindful of being respectful to the heritage of that logo and the composition of that logo as well. And I think we're talking here about distinctive brand assets. Some people call it different things.
Yeah, I know we've had that clarification point. I call them iconic assets.
Iconic assets.
You've seen my door open right on cue. The poodle has just come in.
Yeah, they're cool.
It opens itself. That's he wants to come in and say hello.
Oh, I see. We've just started talking about dogs, and now Ted's here.
Honestly.
So the distinctive brand asset work originates from Airing Bass research, which is around non-brand elements that trigger recognition and recall in consumer and customer minds. So we're thinking logos, color, sonic cues, as you talk, mascots, logo elements, anything that helps us put the recognition together, the consistency between visual, audio, even any sensory. You know, there's the very Chanel number 5. You know, everybody that would know it would know that's what it was. You know, think Diet Coke, think red for Coke and the golden arches. And there has been an absolute slew of adverts recently with no logos on at all. So British Airways did ones with just the window of an airplane and various people looking at, and you could just make out a little bit of the logo. Or the Kellogg's did, they used just the letters OG, and they were talking about being the original cereals. And, you know, so there are, our brains are pretty clever at putting 2 and 2 together, aren't they? I'd say our brain, not always mine on a Friday afternoon, but why is it easier for us to knit these things together? What makes us be able to recall these things, Ginny? What else can you bring from a behavioural science point of view to distinctive brand assets?
I think generically, when it comes to the brain, it's that the repetition is what compounds to make it into a memory. So I don't know if you've heard that neurons that fire together wire together, about how our brains work. And that's what's happening when you see something consistently. It builds that memory. And so that's also aligned to something called the mere exposure effect. So we remember what we see when we see it repeated and we recognize it. And then the more we're exposed to it, the more we like it as well, because it feels familiar. For the most part, like I think sometimes when you have something that's been repeated and is very consistent. Sometimes it's too much. I don't know if you go on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's ads at the moment about themselves are there every single time I open the page, and it's irritating rather than bringing up the the familiarity and the things that we like. But yeah, that's pretty much.
Yeah. And consistency leads us also into time constraints. So at the moment, we are so hardwired into doing things in quarters, financial reasons of we need to report quarterly. So we seem to be in this held to ransom by finance in some ways of we've got to change, we need a new campaign, we need another campaign. Emma, what's your take on the longevity of campaigns and this drive for quarterly momentum?
Well, I think I've probably irritated you enough with my stance on that, Lucy. I think I'm a big believer in long-term platforms and longevity, and I think a huge part of how effective and dynamic you can be at the same time, or consistent, should I say. And see, for me, effective and consistent interchangeable in my head.
I like it, yeah.
But I think consistency is exactly what it says. It's a constant for a prolonged period of time. And how you visualize that and how you bring it to life can change on a quarter by quarter basis. But it has to all stay true to that overarching North Star. And I think if that's built in an emotional territory, in a territory that's reflective of the organization's DNA and the brand's DNA, it's often much easier to respond to those kind of last minute demands. We need a campaign on this to increase revenue on Y. Whatever the business ask is, I always think, it's about having that solid North Star that you've really spent time curating, and whether that kind of edges into brand positioning a little bit, which I know this isn't really about, but that consistent brand position enables flexibility. So actually your unwillingness to move from one territory for a prolonged period doesn't mean you're inflexible or you lack agility. In my mind, it actually brings dynamism. And because you don't have to curate from scratch every time, right?
Exactly. And that is backed up by the science from a high level of actually that familiarity is what you need, like we mentioned at the top. But then in order to grab people's attention, you need the novelty. So having that strong base layer, but making sure you've got something which is system one, and something like novelty, which grabs system two, you can keep a consistent brand in terms of the structure, in terms of the tone, but you can change what's within that to maintain the attention. And so you can keep something consistent for a long period of time, but without losing that spark of interest.
Yeah. There was, if anyone follows Mark Ritson, he had a fantastic article he wrote a while ago. Actually, he gave it as a talk as well. His quote is, "Make fewer, better ads and run them for longer. Reap the rewards in the profit." That's what his basic message was. He says that we are nonsensically short term at the moment, and it's astonishingly clear to him that it can take 2-3 years for a campaign or even just an ad to reach its full effect.
I was just about to say, I think there's a real misunderstanding and lack of information about creative wear out, because creative wear out is different to positioning. And I think you have to be spending at a multi-million pound level. And I don't think I'm allowed to say, but let's say Samsung were spending multi-million pounds on launches, but you still wouldn't see too much creative wear out. You might have to swap your cut downs or something like that. But ultimately, wear out is something that I think marketeers have a potential fear of happening within a week. And it's like, no, it doesn't happen within a week. So I think that's a really interesting, potentially, again, a whole other podcast, Lucy.
Yeah, add it to the list. We're uncovering all sorts of stuff.
It's risky though.
Sorry.
A lot of marketers do know that, but it is also risky within smaller companies to let things just run, especially because there's seasonality in the year, some quarters things dip. And if you're not showing of being productive and you're not showing that you're earning your keep, you risk your job. So for a lot of marketers, it's potentially they do keep changing things because that's how they show that they're delivering, and
That they're
we've
being
pivoted
efficient. Yeah.
marketing. Yeah, we've pivoted it away from being a brand-led and creative-led profession to one that's data-led, which it needed to shift, but we've gone too far, I think, to that data. And we're therefore forgetting about the psychology, and we're forgetting about the importance of brand and demand versus leads. And I think that's also at the detriment of our creative teams. I've worked with some excellent creative teams that have got some amazing ideas and have created a beautiful brand and understand the psychology behind it. But you can't prove ROI on that. And unless they pull from things like behavioral science and psychology and neuroscience to back up why those teams are so important, they're seen as almost like less important than the more sales facing parts of marketing. And I think I think all of that is to the detriment of the marketing profession and teams. And I think business has gotten in the way of itself for the sake of maths and data.
And it's a weird merging, right? Because actually sales and marketing are becoming one and the same, I think, especially with the emergence of all the digital sales channels, the way certain social platforms are going in terms of their shops and stuff like that. And I think the point I always try to make with my teams is it's optimization, not reinvention. So you can still prove your worth without having to brief a whole new creative or a whole new campaign. Sometimes you have to, yes, and that's partly what keeps the job exciting. So we want to do that, I think, quite naturally as marketeers. But there is also a case for, well, how can I use what I have and make it work harder and demonstrate the value of that? I think where it gets a bit tricky is those purist, and Ginny, I'd be keen to hear what you think on this, is the purist brand metrics, which can't necessarily, you can correlate to certain things, but we've just completed brand health tracking for the Royal Kennel Club for a repositioning, and we'll do another one in 6 months and another one in a year, and that gives us an insight into how we're being perceived on some of those more kind of psychologically driven metrics. And I think it's remembering to do that, because I don't think, to your point, people have forgotten that actually this is all one big giant funnel, and you have to track every single part of it if you're going to be effective in which data you should that kind of choose to use. But yeah,
100%. We forget when it comes to the journey of the buyer, just how much happens 5 years beforehand, and we're so focused on that bottom of marketing funnel, which businesses thinks is the entire marketing funnel, that we're missing out on an awful lot.
Yeah. I think it's, what are we up to now in B2B marketing terms? You need 15 touch points for someone to take action. So that's 15 times you have to have a consistent message. You have to be, because otherwise you start again. So shoehorning that into a quarter when some of the sales cycles that we're talking to are 18 months, when you're chopping and changing so often across that customer journey, across that timeline, surely you're asking them to work too hard in putting 2 and 2 together of what they learned in that first touch point 18 months ago to what you're trying to teach them slightly further down the funnel, 18, 24 months later. You're asking too hard.
But putting those 2 points together in kind of this, both far more articulate than what I said earlier, but it's we forget about warming people up to the idea of what a brand can offer. We jump straight into that 12-month sales cycle. This is your revenue target for the year. Go get it. Actually, not that simple, because you can't start at sales. You start at making people fall in love. And I'll tee this up for Ginny. The way I always was educated around it in the FMCG world was you have the rational brain and the more emotional brain. If you don't have the emotional brain, you'll never get the rational, or it's far harder to. And I think with those sales cycles and that pace of change, we have moved away from making people fall in love again. And when I spoke about Birdseye, that was our objective: make people fall in love with us again, because it was a great brand, and same for Go was. And you just tend to forget about it. Because you're looking at those hard commercial targets, and actually they're easier to get if you do this perceived fluffy bit up front.
Yeah, 100%. And I think when you were talking about Birdseye earlier with the captain, it made me think about nostalgia. And I think, at least for millennials and people these days, there's a lot of that coming back of the nostalgia. And that is obviously a byproduct, not a strategy for a team, but then that's because memories are tied to emotions. And once you've got those emotions, then that nostalgia kicks in. And I would never have looked at Bird's Eye, but it hit that this is personal to me. I remember this. This is tied to emotions. It's part of my identity. I remember those fish fingers. I'm going to go out and shop. And then when I'm in the shop and I see Bird's Eye in the freezer, I'm more likely to reach for it. And that's nothing other than built on my nostalgic memories and my emotions. So
Exactly.
agree. And to pop back to your point, Luce, about the over time and how long a B2B sales cycle is, one could argue, if you look at consistency, that when you change something, so I'm a messenger as a brand, and the messenger effect. And so you pay attention to things that you trust and you have confidence in. If you're changing things, it makes your brain think that you're less competent, you're less reliable. It reduces confidence in you. It thinks you're riskier. It has to go back and reevaluate you in terms of at the very base layer. And I haven't done any research on this, but repetition implies survival. It's already been tested. It's not risky. It's not going to hurt me.
Yeah.
So if you as a B2B brand are not consistent, you are potentially hurting your brand from a psychological and base layer perspective. I haven't done any research on that. That's my opinion. Just
big caveat. But I would echo that though, Ginny, because I've seen that numerous times when you go to change product packaging or you go to change, a logo. And Lucy knows how terrified I was coming in with the RKC one and not diluting any equity that was in that, and to really protect it and champion it. And I think there's a real underestimation of how dangerous rebrands can be, not just for that reason, because you're sparking a change. Fundamentally, the majority do not like change. Yeah. And it's scary and it's nervous, and they have to almost get reacquainted with the brand that they know and love. And it's how do you as a marketeer bring people on that journey in a consistent way that's giving that sense of reassurance, because it's the same thing it's always been, or it's the same product, we haven't touched it in the case of some of the other brands I've worked on. And it is potentially one of the riskiest things you can do, I think, as a brand is a repositioning or a rebrand, because you need to be so sure of what you're doing and do all of the due diligence behind it. And again, as Lucy will attest, I made sure all the research was done before we hit the button. And I wouldn't take that risk, because I just think, who am I to take that risk? It's such a important thing to get right.
Yeah, I think you are very respectful of, you're a guardian of the brand. There will be people that come after you. There have been people that have come before you. And I think that's the mentality you showed, is that you're the guardian. You're here to protect it from to keep it relevant today, but reminiscent and mindful of yesteryear as well. And I think that definitely comes across in your approach. And we've all seen the horror stories of Gap. People were protesting outside the Gap store because they changed their logo.
Crazy.
Good
I
grief.
don't remember that. Oh my word.
Yeah, it was like the blue box, that they got rid of the blue box and changed the typeface. And oh my word.
Like controversially, I quite like it. I liked the plainer kind of look and execution, and their price point, whilst it's not super expensive, I felt the new logo, the price point and what they were offering was
different.
Actually, but it all quite fit together neatly in my mind, which I quite like. But that's my mind. Who am I?
We won't delve too deep into that. Even as a behavioural scientist, you don't go there. Don't go there.
I'm like, I don't know. And also, I don't know what their new logo is. I didn't even know they changed it.
Did you see
it back, haven't they?
Oh, yeah, they changed it for you. And Jaguar Land Rover, their rebrand got absolutely picked apart for...
Didn't we talk about the Burberry one, Lise, as well?
Yeah.
Because I think they're very interesting. So they've gone from one extreme, then they went the other extreme, and now they're kind of going back that direction, but a slightly different take on it, maybe. I don't know, Lucy will be better placed to talk about their logo design, but I find it very interesting, and that resurgence of heritage. And actually, there's loads of brands doing that, and it's going back to those consistent, safe things that have been there for decades.
Yeah, and it's the equity in it, that builds up over time. I think the Coca-Cola bottle has been around since the 50s. You know, the Golden Arches, I think, has been around since probably the early 50s as well. These things take time, and I think that brand owners are starting to see that there's equity in it. There's that recall that, you know, Ginny's shopping in the supermarket and she sees the captain and she's putting 2 and 2 together and she's having fish finger sarnie for dinner tonight.
But
You know,
it's also
there's
driving
equity in it.
preference.
Yeah.
It's also driving preference as well, right? Because with that Bird's Eye brand, and we'll talk about Bird's Eye a lot now, I hope they're okay with it. But with that Bird's Eye brand, they have to justify that price premium. So actually, if you're talking about kind of what it is that makes people pay the extra pound, or what it is that makes people pick you over someone else, it is that reassurance, that love, that heritage that is all consistently executed that makes you make that decision at the point of sale.
Nice.
So I think,
Yeah, sorry, Emma. Go.
no, go on.
I was just going to say, it's because we don't need to make a choice at that stage. It's embedded in memory, so we're retrieving it, which is the shortcut. So your brain is picking the least path of resistance, and that's Bird's Eye because it recognizes the captain.
Yeah. 1915 for the Coke bottle, if I flicking through my notes. So
And for their C, didn't they do an experiment in the 80s with the C? That if they took everything else away and you just had the C on a piece of paper, people would know that was Coca-Cola.
people would still know it was
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's our brains putting 2 and 2 together and figuring out it's a Coke advert. So from 1915 to modern day AI, and how the AI makes it easier than ever to churn content out at scale. What does that mean? What could that mean for brand effectiveness, consistency, content in particular? Because AI seems to be most regularly used to churn through content. Is that how do we feel about AI and keeping content consistent? Emma, what's your take? Is it a threat to all of your hard work, or is it going to help reinforce it?
Well, I have to say it's a threat to all our hard work, Casey. But I think it's the point we kind of touched on earlier. There is a palpable shift from repetition to accumulation, in the sense that it's the churning of more content that is kind of going to undermine or maybe redefine, who knows, what building a brand actually means. And, you know, we talk about consistent execution. I think from my perspective, in terms of brand building, it will make the bit we talked about being forgotten more important, because our core idea and the emotional territory in which brands are playing is going to have to be so robust and so locked down, such that there isn't the opportunity to kind of just churn out mass stuff unless there is that true understanding of the DNA of a brand. And so actually, I think it could see a complete move back to way brands were built in years gone by. And we might actually see a full swing, but we're definitely in the middle of a shift to quantity over quality, I think.
Yeah.
But there's loads of loose ends. I mean, there's loads of different ways you could approach that as well, right? Because we're also, I feel, the society in which we're operating with that question has changed. So if you look at the way people consumed goods decades ago versus the way they consume them now, that has changed. And that in part is playing a role in how marketing teams are responding to those needs. Like if you take some of the, I won't say brand names, if you take some of the larger scale clothing manufacturers, they're just churning stuff out. People are buying it and going away, which is having a knock-on effect at the line. Then you add in AI from the other side, and then it's quite a fundamental challenge, I think, to all marketeers. But I do think identifying the core idea, the emotional territory, and staying very true to your role in that story is going to be important.
Yeah. I think the speed that life happens at the moment, I think, is unprecedented, and the rate of change is so immense. We're hanging on for dear life most of the time with the speed of everything that's going on around us. So Ginny, then, and whilst we're talking about AI, why does coherence matter more than frequency or quality?
I've got a number of thoughts. One, it's just in AI in general, one could argue there's consistency because everyone is sounding the same. So they're just consistent horizontally rather than vertically. And I think that is a risk that you can always tell when something's written by AI. And I think that's because people have forgotten to be consistent within their brand. And I think that's a risk with AI. And the reason why, again, that brand is so important, and that tone of voice and that repetition and all of that, it's to build that familiarity. And there's something called bounded rationality that humans have, which behavioral science is more or less based on. One would assume that humans choose what the most optimal, that optimize their decisions, but we don't. We do something which is called satisficing, which is we choose what's good enough based on how quickly our brains can process it. So if something reduces effort and reduces the pathways it has to go through, we'll pick that option, even if it's more expensive, even if it's not as good. If it means that our brains need to expel less energy, we'll
The path of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly. And that's bounded rationality. So when you put it on paper, it might make no sense, but to our brains, it does.
Fair enough. Good stuff. Good stuff. So quick fire stuff. What's one thing? Sorry. Yeah. What's one thing we think marketers could do today, tomorrow, to make their work more consistent? What would your advice be to help someone when they're thinking, do you know what? I'm not being consistent. I am flitting around too much. I am being asked to do too much. What's our advice?
Right, quick fire. So I'll go quickly. I'm sure I'll walk away from this and go, why did I say that? But where my head is right now, my gut reaction is a clear North Star based on the DNA and the heritage of the brand and what the brand actually stands for. Because I think if you have a clear North Star, even if you are pulled in 50 different directions and given 20 million things to do, you can still consistently execute against your North Star. And that ticks the consistency box. I think the challenge, if you come outside of brands with that, is that there's and I wanted to say it earlier and kind of didn't wiggle it in, but we often forget that product matching brand is vital, that sales teams and all of the various different functions that are external facing, and I believe even internally, being consistent to that brand is so important as well. And I think it's not overlooking those ways of reinforcing your consistent North Star that you have in your brand. It's like, you know, if McDonald's went and decided to launch a car, you wouldn't buy that car because it makes no sense. Right. So, and it's not
the badge on the front of the
what
car
they've done for
there.
the last. Yeah. But I suppose that would be my on the spot gut reaction. And I'll write to you later and tell you an intelligible answer.
Oh, I think that's great. Ginny?
I'm going to take a slightly different tack. Not that I disagree with Emma, but just to complement it. I would do an audit of your brand cues. So have a look at everything you've put out in the market in terms of logo, color, look and feel. A lot of teams will be doing this already, but some teams will have just been caught up in everything, and just audit how consistent it is and how does it look. And if you're looking at it and you're a bit unsure or it's not quite feeling right, pass that across to your creative team or your creative agency and ask them to have at it. And I'm sure they come back with something excellent.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, hey, because that's kind of, if you've been in the market for a long time as a brand, that is so often the case where you've either forgotten your brand guidelines and your North Star, you've put them in a drawer somewhere, easy to forget about. Enforcing or embedding is a better word, brand guidelines in an organization is often really difficult. So actually having that audit is really nice, especially I think if your brand's been live for a certain amount of time, because it's so easy to stray away from.
Yeah. And if you need to be brand police, use behavioral science tools to change people's behavior in the company to
absolutely
get on board with the brand.
Yeah. I'm thinking about a bottle of whiskey.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're both really good suggestions. So thank you for that. I think there's an element of bravery in consistency. I think you have to be and it ties in a little bit with a previous episode that we talked about clarity and consistency. Once you've got your message, once you know what you're talking about, stay true to it. If you truly, honestly, as an organization, a business, a product owner, believe in what you've written down, stick to it, believe in it, trust it. That doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's, make sure you get it right in the first place and then stick to it. Trust that you know what you're doing.
And I think that's actually a real pressure for marketeers today, right? Because we understand that as a cohort or as a discipline. I think when you start having other disciplines or consumers or whatever coming against that or disagreeing or not seeing the immediate results or not seeing the tangible outcomes, it's trying to defend that and maintain course. So I think the other trait I'd add in there, Lucy, is resilience, because I think you have to be fairly resilient to actually stay true to your course, as you rightly say, but actually there's a real battle internally sometimes to maintain that course.
Yeah, agreed. It's not never easy, is it? But we know it's the right thing to do, but you've got to quite often take more stakeholders along with you that have slightly different needs or desires for the business. So the last important question, if consistency were a biscuit, what biscuit would it be? Ginny, I'm going to come to you first.
I am going to say a rich tea biscuit, simply because it's familiar. And if in doubt and you're not sure what else is going on the plate, you know what you're getting with a rich tea. I mean, they did change the size of it recently. Well, 10 years
They made
ago.
them smaller, didn't they?
They did. So it would fit in.
Make the mug bigger. Don't make the biscuit smaller.
But so maybe one could argue that's the novelty, to remind people that they exist. I don't know. But so I'm going with rich tea biscuit.
Emma?
I am going to go with the caramel chocolate digestive. So where I started was the same place as Ginny. It's like, oh, well, it should be something fairly stable and fairly consistent, but using the word. But then I also think there's a creativity and a thinking outside the box with consistency when it works well, which is where the caramel comes in for me.
I would have had good money on you saying a dog biscuit.
Oh, that would have been smart, wouldn't it?
My biscuit, I'm going to play on the word...
biscuits, not Ted's biscuits.
Yeah, that's true. My biscuit, I'm going to play on the word consistency and say that the biscuit for me that it is not is a hobnob, because I hate the consistency of a hobnob. Don't get it. Don't understand it. It's congealed sand. Just shouldn't be allowed.
See,
no.
To me, it's like you're eating a biscuit, but it doesn't feel as bad. Or as unhealthy.
A healthy biscuit.
Yeah.
No, I don't. If I'm eating a biscuit, I don't want a healthy biscuit. I want a biscuit. So yeah, that's me. I'm an anti-consistency hobnob. That's what I'm voting for. So controversial right at the end there.
It's a nice play. It was quite controversial. I love how we all went totally different directions with it.
Yeah.
It's always interesting.
And Lucy took the risk. So well done, Lucy.
Oh, that's nice, Lucy.
Yeah.
So it just leaves me to say thank you both very much for joining us on the Consistency Challenge Accepted podcast. If you've lasted this long, thank you for watching. Please hit subscribe and catch up with episodes you might have already missed. There's still more to come. But thank you very much for joining us. Emma, thank you very much for joining us as always, Ginny.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.